I find myself having both anxiety about the future as well as ruminating about the past to a point of a deep depression at times. Bojack Horseman has so many characters that are deeply flawed and are all struggling just to be happy, but I think they all struggle with this in their own ways. Trying to find the right amount of distraction or trying to figure out if distraction is appropriate is difficult as well. I think Bojack struggles with this throughout the entire show as he is clearly depressed and often uses drugs or material things to try and push his depression away. In the first episode of the show, Princess Carolyn tells Bojack that he clearly doesn't love himself. And this is part of Bojack's battle with himself. He so desperately wants to think of himself as a good person, and I don't really agree with this way of thinking. What I mean is just that putting that pressure on yourself is such a difficult thing to do for someone coming from Bojack's circumstances. Of course he has hurt people and done bad things, and some people are always going to think of him in a bad light, but I've never really understood labeling yourself or others in that way. The reason I found it easy to root for Bojack as a character is his authenticity. He's definitely a very closed-off person, but I don't find him inauthentic in any way. You can pretty much see what he's feeling all the time, and he won't try to pretend to be happy for other people. He's gonna say what he thinks, even if the reality is he's coming off as bitter or miserable. I have respect for people who are able to express those feelings because they are often looked down upon and are things that typically I feel like people are expected to suppress. And when it comes to suppressing emotions, the character that first came to mind was Mr. Peanut Butter, but I don't think this actually applies to him. I think he just genuinely does find it easier to be happy in life compared to almost every other character in the show, and that's why it's so easy to hate him, at least for me. Bojack's relationship with Diane is arguably the main storyline. Their relationship reminds me in so many ways of things I have experienced with a few different people in my life. I think typically when I see people talk about their relationship, they tend to portray Bojack as the villain or bad guy, and I understand how people get there. He definitely has his fair share of misunderstandings, and there is a clear power dynamic at play when he first meets Diane. Diane was a fan of his show growing up, and is also technically working for him, which he ends up reminding her when they get in a fight at the end of season 1. The thing is, these power dynamics can easily change, and it does for Bojack and Diane throughout the show. I don't think either character is purposefully hurting the other, but obviously there are reasons they end up doing it to each other. Diane is clearly not happy in her relationship with Mr. Peanut Butter, at least not enough to have deep emotional intimacy with him, so she seeks this out in other places in her life. I also think her being a generally more depressed person than Mr. Peanut Butter makes her feel slightly scared to be her authentic self, which she feels more comfortable being around Bojack. A perfect example of this is in season 2 when Diane is at one of her most depressed and lowest points in the show, and she chooses to crash at Bojack's house for months without telling Mr. Peanut Butter. I think Bojack's biggest mistake in terms of his relationship with Diane is interpreting the emotional intimacy that they have as romantic intimacy. I actually think this is more specific to the earlier seasons too, and that their relationship becomes more complicated in the later seasons of the show. But I can understand how Bojack gets here. I think for someone who is as starved for validation and connection, the void of one or a little bit of this need being filled makes it so that he wants more from this one person. Now I'm going to talk about Princess Carolyn, who is one of my favorite animated characters in general. The way she is constantly in go mode and never slows down in terms of her work is very representative of middle-class American culture and the way that things are set up for people here. And the entire show follows her working to take the barrier she put up down and find time for herself and time to let others in. And it works. She eventually confronts the fact that she wants a family and ends up adopting a baby, and the final episodes of the show take place at her wedding. Also, another thing I like about her, this doesn't really matter, but she's from North Carolina originally, and even though I'm from New York, the East Coast is the East Coast, so I just like her for that a little bit too. Moving on to Sarah Lynn, who is arguably the most tragic character in the show. She's Bojack's on-screen daughter in the Horsing Around days, and they develop a strange relationship as she grows up. When she and Bojack are together, they seem to enable the most self-destructive parts of themselves, sorta similarly to his dynamic with Diane, but here I would say more is Bojack's responsibility because of the sorta half-parental role that he assumes with Sarah Lynn. Sarah Lynn and Bojack eventually end up going on a bender where Sarah Lynn ends up overdosing and dies. This is an example of this show portraying an unhappy ending, which I think is kinda showed throughout its entirety with different characters. The show doesn't take the angle of all these characters having a happy ending. All the characters in the show are deeply flawed in one way or another. And I think this is a more realistic depiction of reality in general. I think most adults don't really have things figured out and are just trying their best to get by.